it's Drybear. Continue our series of going over leveling builds for all the classes in Path of Exile 2, and today I want to talk about the Bone Witch build that is minionless and focuses primarily on physical damage, critical strikes, and overall bone spells. Now, I know there's a lot of people out there that want minionless builds for Witch, so the Chaos build we put out is without minions, and this Bone build is without minions as well, and this one kind of surprised me. I didn't think that pure bone casting was going to be worthwhile, but it's actually surprisingly good, and you can get a ridiculous amount of critical strike or pretty early on in the game. I mean, in this footage I was pushing through campaign, I was able to get to about 56% critical strike chance and nearly 300% critical strike damage with the bone skills, and it scales well with physical damage and spell damage, all of which works with the build in general. And I think it's super fun to just walk around with bone skills, putting up Bone Cage, throwing out Bone Storm, and occasionally using Unearth if you get the opportunity, but it gives you so many options for just dealing really high single target damage. And what's awesome about this too is that you have good control of AoE. You can get power charges for Bone Storm if you'd like. You can kill single target and do AoE as well. And then when you get to like a big boss, you can just burn them down with ridiculous single target bursts on top of that. So we're gonna be running with the 3 bone skills right off the bat with support gems that work for them, but also gonna be putting a crossbow on our back for armor piercing rounds. And this is for a multitude of reasons. The first one is that when you use Bone Storm, it puts a debuff on the target that makes the next attack, physical attack on the target, consume a stack or debuff charge on the target and do bonus physical damage. However, all of your bone spells are spells, and this is meant to be a synergy for like having physical minions, so that you shoot the Bone Storm against the target and all of your physical minions will whack the target, removing stacks and doing extra physical damage. However, we can benefit from it as well by just putting a crossbow on our back and doing armor piercing rounds, which is a high rapid fire shot, which is a whole bunch of damage to the target while also getting bonus physical damage from the debuff on Bone Storm. Now, unfortunately, because Bone Storm hits so many times and puts so many debuffs on the target, you'll get anywhere from 10 to 20 plus, and you can't consume all those at once. I really wanted to do a burst bone build where you do armor shred with Bone Storm, get fully broken armor, consume that with exploit weakness in order to do bonus damage on it. But it doesn't matter how many or how big the spell is or the physical effect is. The hits will only consume 1 debuff charge from Bone Storm, which means that you kind of have to have a rapid fire effect, a multi-hit effect to benefit from it, or you would just do minions, which we don't need to do for this build. Everything works as it is. So you basically would use Bone Storm to build up the debuff, use armor piercing rounds to pull off the debuffs, and shred armor, which I did confirm works on bone spells for physical damage as well. So your Bone Storm and your Bone Cage will benefit from the target having no armor on them, and then you just consume the exploit weakness when it's about to expire with Bone Cage for a high burst, and then go right back to Bone Storm. And again, I love it when simple builds just work, right? You can just get a very simple list of stats: physical damage, spell damage, critical strikes, and that's it. And all the physical damage applies to your crossbow as well as your bone spells. You just shred the target of armor, blow them up with crits, and you just get easy, ridiculous shred damage on top of this. The armor breaks, and we just start throwing Bone Storms out. This is what, you know, a good test of this, as this is kind of like an old school patchwork fight where it is a DPS race. So this is at eye level. We're just throwing out Bone Storms, shredding armor, and you can see that we can get up to 60 stacks on the target. And then when we use the armor piercing rounds, we're consuming those stacks and applying armor break at the same time. Each stack will give us bonus physical damage on every hit of armor piercing rounds, and then we just start shredding with Bone Storm again as well. When you have fully broken armor, you can actually use Bone Cage to consume it with exploit weakness for bonus damage, and Bone Cage does have a very high single hit burst, and then you just consume right back into it and go into that loop there as well. And what's cool is that when you get towards the end of Act 2, Act 3, you can work in the Combat Frenzy Resonance combo to get power charges from Pin on Bone Cage, and then you just burst down and you're doing AoE with your Bone Storm as well. Of course, we have the handy dandy one sheet for all of this here, and I also have the wand, the offhand focus, and the crossbow on here that you want to aim towards the stats you're looking for. And you can also get critical strike on your helm and your amulet. You can get critical strike damage bonus on your gloves. All of these work great for a crit style build. I have the passive skill tree, a little bit of description of the gameplay and how to play for it, and the abilities. But again, this is a very simple, you only need a couple abilities and a couple support gems to get this one online, and you'll be able to clear the entire campaign on normal and cruel, just burning through it with this build. And if the one sheet is less your style, I have built this out on Mobalytics as well online. I was able to save the stats here for the gear. So if you're looking for that, you can see that we can get critical strike damage bonus on our gloves. You can get crit chance on the amulet. You can get crit chance on the helmet. All of this works together. And we're going to be running crossbow on the offhand with a bone wand and a focus on the offhand and the main set there as well. And I think for this, you can run very easily energy shield plus invasion, mostly energy shield and life, but all of that works together while you're leveling and should be just fine enough. And then you work in things later on as you unlock with the Ascendancy built into this as well, which for this, I think the best option is by far Blood Mage. All right, let's talk about the build and the ins and outs for this one. Like I said, it is pretty straightforward. When you start leveling, you're going to be starting with Unearth, and Unearth is just a very straightforward skill. It does physical damage and goes in a cone in front of you. If it hits a corpse, you'll be able to summon some of these little bone dudes. And what's cool about the bone dudes is they actually scale with your damage as well. So when you actually get more spell damage or physical damage, their damage will scale up with it as well. Not quite as effectively, but it will give you some extra value from it. It's not really worth investing in. Sometimes they're just good for cannon fodder to stand in front of you, which is nice. So you can actually have something to just block projectiles or be in the way. And I wouldn't invest in anything minion stat-wise to keep them up, but this is going to be your bread and butter while leveling. It's just using Unearth. Once you unlock Bone Cage, that's probably going to be your better option for damage. Bone Cage has ridiculous damage scaling. This thing hits like a mother flippin' truck. It hits so hard. And it also has a pin mechanic on it as well, which is how we're going to get the extra charges from Combat Fresn to scale off that as well. So you can kind of just, once you get Bone Cage, you can just kind of sit on this and just shoot. Keep in mind that if you put the Bone Cage up, the previous one will disappear. And also if enemies walk into the spikes, it will still deal the Bone Cage damage on top of that. So usually once you have it fully built out, you can put the Bone Cage up and then you can start casting inside of it, shoot, Bone Cage up, casting inside of it, shoot, and anything that comes near you will impale themselves on the Bone Cage. And even later on, you can even use Unearth on corpses you create with your other spells to create a little wall of minions in front of you, Bone Cage, and then just start shooting on top of that as well. Then you'll unlock your Bone Storm, and this is going to be like the core of your build. For this specifically, I like running Arcane Tempo and Scattershot. What's interesting is that this is kind of like a, Ember Fusillade kind of thing where you have to build up the projectiles and then fire them. But what's cool about this is if you run Scattershot, it will reduce the damage and cast speed, but it also creates projectiles faster as well. So this is without Scattershot. You can see how slow it is, and then you can build this up a little bit better, and you'll see that it's way faster. You can actually get to full charge here. With Bone Storm, keep in mind that you don't really need to fully charge it every time. It is kind of a linear increase in damage. It creates more projectiles, which do more damage. But as you get used to using Bone Storm as well, you'll notice that every time you fire, since it fires in like that old school, Space Invaders Galaga style, that there might be an enemy right in front of you, but with how wide it gets, the left and right side might miss anyways. Like, you're just not going to get damage on those projectiles. So you'll get into the rhythm as you're playing to like fire a little bit earlier, so you can just get the projectiles are going to hit the target, and it starts getting faster and faster, and you get a lot of damage out of that. But if there's a lot of enemies in front of you, you can go wide as well. If you really wanted to, you could run with like Pierce on this too. I haven't found it to be as needed, but it does work, which means you'll get piercing through the main target. And this is super helpful like in doorways when one mob is in the front and you shoot all your projectiles to hit them to deal damage that way, and then something gets stuck, which prevents them, which is kind of annoying, but it gives you that like that freedom to pierce through if you'd like, or just getting extra pierce from it, which just gives it a little bit more flexibility while you're leveling. So those are your 3 spells from the occult tree, and you'll be casting these, kind of creating minions if you like. I like running with Feeding Frenzy and Corpse Conservation. Gives you a little extra damage here. You can also run with Instability to make your minions explode if you wanted to. Their HP values are going to be relatively low, so it's not like it's going to do a ton of damage, but it does give you a little bit more AoE if that's what you're looking for. Then we get some really cool combinations when we unlock enough stats to get armor-piercing rounds. The challenge with going from Witch down to Mercenary weapon is that you have primary intelligence availability, and then you're going to have strength and dexterity. So to use a crossbow and to use a crossbow ability, you will need equal parts strength and dex, which will put a little bit of a strain on you for stats early on, depending on how you want to spend them. So either you get stats from the attribute highway, or you get stats from gear that drops for you to pick that up, or you can also just keep armor-piercing rounds a little under-leveled, depending on the stats you have available. But what's awesome about armor-piercing rounds is that debuff we talked about earlier. So if we shoot some shots into this target here, I'm going to bone cage on small minions, but you can actually shoot, and you can see that let's take off our weapons so we can actually show the debuff without instantly killing them with a crit. So we just want to find an enemy that has enough HP, such as right here. So we're going to kill all these off, make sure these die, and then you'll notice that if we hit it with targets, you're going to get that debuff on the target as well. A little bit of that debuff stacking up on the target. Now, it stacks up quite a lot on the target, so you see I have 3 stacks here, and it gets consumed by physical damage attacks that hit the target, not spells. And so when you see that, you can very easily just switch to your crossbow and start firing to consume those stacks to get extra damage. We're also going to be running with Splinter and Demolisher so we can shred armor, and armor does work on the physical damage of spells as well. Gives you a little bit of freedom there. So if we throw this forward and we get a stack on them without accidentally one-shotting them, we'll be able to get some damage on that, and then you can consume it by switching to the crossbow, break the armor, and then you can also run with Exploit Weakness on the bone cage so that you can just pop this, destroy it, kill them all, and then get some big damage on that as well. Completing the cycle, and it works great for single target and bossing. Now, on the topic of the conversion for Combat Frenzy, this one is very popular right now. Combat Frenzy is a spirit gem that allows you to gain a frenzy charge when you freeze, electrocute, or pin. However, we have a ridiculous amount of pin buildup with Bone Cage, which means that we can use that to create frenzy charges. And since we're already going over here for the physical damage and the massive damage and crit chance, we can very easily just pop over and pick up Resonance, which means that when we get a frenzy charge, we instead get a power charge. And if you happen to have a power charge when you use the Bone Storm, it'll glow blue and it'll have an AoE explosion on every projectile that flies out, which just gives you a little bit more oomph when you're mobbing or doing a little bit more damage to targets that you're shooting at. And it's not really something that you need to get on for online for leveling, but because we're in the area and the synergy is so easy, we have pin already in the build, we don't have to change the build to get anything. I think it's a very easy thing to get online around the end of Act 2, start of Act 3 on normal mode, and then through Cruel. Next, let's talk about the skill tree and how you're going to set this up to get the most amount of damage for you in this build. You're going to want a mixture of spell power and physical damage, but because we're doing physical spells and the crossbow, physical damage is going to be your most valuable stat, followed by critical strike chance and critical strike damage. And you also notice too that when you get to this point here, when we start grabbing a lot of crit chance and crit damage, while we aren't directly getting like damage scalars like power, physical damage, spell power, that sort of thing, we are getting critical strike damage bonus, which is a power scalar. And there's even things like getting increased damage after you've dealt a critical hit. So we have 36%, once we crit, we get 36% increased damage, 20% increased damage, 30% increased damage, right? So all of that gets applied. So we get a large damage scalar once we crit, and we crit so often that we're getting that damage. And also when we crit, we're getting the critical strike bonus on the damage as well. So even though we're not grabbing a large amount of power early on, as long as we have enough critical damage bonus and we have those other damages, we can make up for that through the numbers that come through. So you're gonna start here at the top for Witch. I would just grab the spell power. It's the cleanest one. I thought about maybe kind of cutting out through the attribute highway, but it's just so easy to grab the spell power here, and you get a little bit of an intelligence, which is nice as well. Then we go up and we grab the 2 physical damage nodes that are here, 18% and 10%, plus crit chance for spells. We get the spell damage and we come straight up here, and then you want to immediately grab the crit damage bonus and crit chance for all of these, plus increased spell damage if you've crit recently. All of this together is going to give you a huge boost, and with these nodes plus Unearth and Bone Cage early, you should fly through Act 1 very easily. Then what I would do is I wouldn't get this node here. Our plan was to grab some spell damage later on in the game. I would just come down here, go over here, and you can pick up these nodes here. Getting the extra crit chance, though it is multiplicative, is going to keep increasing your damage more and more. And again, if you've crit recently, plus the crit damage, all of this is going to go really well. Come over here, come down, and then pick up these as well. This is more crit damage bonus, crit chance. It also gives you crit damage bonus if you've dealt a non-critical hit recently, which means every time you don't crit, you get more crit damage on the next crit, plus more crit overall. Then we grab more crit chance here, and then also increased damage if you crit in the last 8 seconds, which should always be up. And you can even get this extra crit here as well. Later on, if you want to, you can also get the cast speed, main stats, and more crit damage bonus here as well. The starting point for the monk, which I think works perfectly fine for that. Then we're going to follow the attribute highway and head towards this group of nodes here, which is super nutrient rich. You can come up here, and I think you probably usually want to go ahead and just grab the raw physical damage initially. So get physical damage, break additional armor if they have an ailment, which they usually won't until you get bleed online later on. But it gives you main stat strength, physical damage. You can grab physical damage here as well. Then you can grab 10 dexterity and 10 intelligence. So 10 of each of the main stats gives you a huge boost in trying to put this build together. Then you want to go ahead and grab more of this crit, get the damage after you crit on both of these, plus more crit chance. And if you really feel like it, towards the end of Act 2 or start of Act 3, you can start working in Combat Frenzy with Resonance, so you can use power charges. Though it's not perfectly necessary, it is something that has some value there. Then from that standpoint, you have a couple options on where you want to go. There is some physical damage easily to pick up here with crit chance. Like these three here are pretty easy to pick up, and they'll give you a jewel slot as well. However, there's one major challenge with this side of the tree that we are missing out on relative to bone casting or bone spells in general. And it's probably the thing that like a lot of witch bone casters are screaming about with this initial start here, and that is all of the benefits you get in the top left corner of the screen for the Bone Witch. And I tried both of these, and you can get some great value from going left. I even had like a lot of comparisons of team left versus team right for the initial leveling of this build. Like, do you come over here and you grab these crit nodes here, come up and grab these physical nodes, chance to bleed, bonus physical damage, bleed scaling, you break armor when you crit. All of these are super nice, but I find this to be way more powerful early on. And then as you move into Cruel, then you can go over and grab these hyper value options. So what I would do after this is if you wanted to, you could grab cast speed, which will work for Bone Storm. But most importantly is this group of nodes here, this triangle right next to your start area. You will get a large amount of crit chance, increased crit chance if you haven't crit, increased crit chance against enemies that are affected by no elemental ailments, which they won't. Keep in mind that this doesn't include bleeding because it's not an elemental ailment. So you'll be able to add that as well. And increased crit chance against enemies that are on full life. So if you hit them when they're full life, you get a whole bunch of crit chance off of that. These nodes are super nice. And you also have this option here. This gives you crit chance for spells, which is nice, damage bonus, and increased crit speed or cast speed, which again works great for the Bone Storm. Then what you want to do is you want to grab these two diamonds here, this diamond here and this diamond here. So I recommend going for this one, come up there through the attribute highway, take this right side here, cut over and then grab this jewel slot and grab these. This gives you increased physical damage, break armor when you crit, which is super nice. This adds really nicely to the build overall. Break armor on crit, you get chance to bleed, and you inflict bleed on that, which is based on the damage of the hit. So if you inflict the bleed with Bone Cage, it's going to be higher, which is really nice, plus increased physical damage, all that's really nice, plus the jewel socket. Then come around and grab these. This is more physical damage, more chance to bleed, increased chance for spells, increased bleed on top of everything else, and all of this runs together, which is really cool. I just found that because the bleed scaling is based on the hit that created the bleed, for the most part while leveling, I found it to be far inferior to start out here and go left to grab these bone casting nodes initially, that it would result in a very weak leveling build initially, where if you just went for crit and physical scaling on this side as well, plus damage after you crit, like all this extra damage after you crit gives you crazy scaling, and you can even get power charges from this as well, then cut back over and get these cool synergy effects that add even more damage on top of everything else, which will help a lot with bosses as well. Next up for Ascendancy, I would go Blood Mage here. There are some damage scalers and defensive options on the Infernalist side, but there's just so much synergy with bleed, critical strikes, and physical damage in the Blood Mage tree that everything just falls into place. So you're forced to take this initial one here, and while leveling, once you get into the Trial of Chaos for the first time, I would just go here and grab this. This is chance to inflict bleeding on critical strike, plus extra damage as physical, plus elemental damage also contributes to bleeding magnitude, which this wouldn't initially matter, but if you ended up having elemental on your crossbow or something, you can add to that as well, but the extra damage as physical is quite nice. Then you can cut over here for third and fourth Ascendancy, crit chance for spells, increased crit damage per 40 life, so as you start stacking up life, you get a whole bunch of crit damage, plus more crit chance for spells, plus you get a base crit chance for spells. I'm not sure with this one if this ended up being worth it or not, given our crit chance, but I think this will actually just be a net increase for you. You can also go for survivability like Leech or Extra Life or Stagger, the Brewmaster Stagger if you really need to survive, but this is going to give you a huge boost in damage overall. Then when it comes to gear, you want to make sure that you get a lot of physical damage, critical strike, strike chance for spells, critical strike damage for spells, and critical damage bonus. As much crit as you can through your gear. Remember that you can get crit on your wand, you can get crit on your focus, you can get crit chance on your helm and your amulet, you can get crit damage bonus on your gloves. So if you can find ways to do that while leveling, either by crafting or by getting lucky on the drops, or if you're in a trade league trading for those sort of things, as long as they're cheap enough to keep you moving along. Obviously, you want to max out your resistances if you can, get as much life and energy shield as you can. A little bit of invasion goes a long way as well, and then just stacking up physical damage too. Physical damage on the crossbow plus life on hit for the crossbow, since it is a martial weapon, then life on kill and life regeneration helps a lot. The way that I solve the currently, the way that I solve the Blood Mage challenge of always hurting yourself when you cast is just raw life regeneration. Just life regeneration as a stat seems to be good enough to solve that, as long as you're not going for extra. Like in our Chaos build, since we had the Event Horizon, we were chipping ourselves even more, so I even started getting like life recouped from damage taken. But I think life regen and life on kill is plenty for this, especially if you're on energy shield. You have enough to be able to absorb that and attack and push forward, which all of that kind of comes back together. So just make sure you have a good amount of scaling on this. The stat is very simple. Get physical damage, spell physical damage, crit chance, damage scaling, and as much survival as you can, and then just throw bone storms out until everything dies. If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.